I'm here to talk to you about aquaculture and how humans are farming in the ocean. What I hope to do today is give you a very broad overview as to what aquaculture is, what's being done and how it's being done, and kind of educate you about the basics of the aquaculture industry. We're going to start with an introduction to aquaculture, talking very broadly about what it is. The second part of our presentation is actually going to go in depth and looking at the fish farming process from obtaining eggs all the way growing them out through market size. So pretty much the entire aquaculture process. And finally, we're going to talk about some environmental concerns that I'm sure many of you have. I get lots of questions about that. So we'll close up with a question and answer session. So if you guys can all think of some questions at the end, that would be great. All right, so let's begin. What is aquaculture? Aquaculture is simply the cultivation and rearing of marine organisms. So any organism that's cultivated in water, it can be either fresh or salt, is considered part of aquaculture. So that is not just fish, but also includes crabs, lots of invertebrates, and even algae. Many tens of thousands of years ago, what made humans so successful was the ability to cultivate the land. And that's not only domesticating animals, but also plants. And what has happened within the last couple hundred years is that we've learned how to do the same in the ocean. And the advantage is that there is so much more ocean on this planet than there is land. We are actually running out of land, and there are far fewer competing uses of that ocean resource. So for instance, we not only have to live on that land and do all of our other activities, but there's what lots of people consider this vast ocean that is essentially untapped in terms of farming. Now, aquaculture is the fastest food-producing sector in the world. Sorry, the fastest growing food-producing sector in the world. And what's interesting is that roughly 50% of all of the seafood, all of the fish consumed on this planet is now farm-raised. So lots of what you're eating, and you may not always know it, is coming from farms and not from the traditional methods of fishing. A brief look at the history of aquaculture. Even though modern aquaculture is fairly recent, humans have been doing some sort of ocean cultivation for a very, very long time. Now, the earliest concrete records we have is back from China, where there are actually written records of aquaculture being done almost 6,000 years ago. In Australia, there are actually cave paintings and other pictures showing the Aborigines that were farming eels in giant earthen ponds. Those were dated to 10,000 years ago. So it's very possible that humans have been doing this for a very long time. But it's important to point out that what they were doing is very different to what modern aquaculture is today. And the main difference is they simply would gather existing animals from the ocean and move them into some kind of pond or cage and grow them up to be bigger. Now, what we're doing now is actually breeding them, obtaining their young and raising them to breed again or to become suitable for seafood. So we've essentially closed the life cycle here, which requires lots of science and technology. And that's some of the stuff that we'll talk about today. Now, I'd like to start my presentations giving an overview as why lots of people think aquaculture is not only important, but actually necessary. So we, at the moment, have what some consider a human population crisis. Now, for those of you that were born around the 1950s, which many of you probably were, you have seen the world's population triple in your lifetime, which is unheard of. So it was around 2.5 billion in 1950. It's currently sitting around 7.4 billion. And by about 2050, it'll be close to 10 billion. So we have a whole lot of people. And on this planet, there is a food insecurity issue. So we have roughly 800 million people on this planet, lots of them who are children who are chronically malnourished. And that means that they can't actually get the proper type of food. They are having growth deformities and other types of problems. So growing food in the ocean is seen as an untapped resource which can help contribute to feed the world. Not only to feed the people that are hungry, but also as a way of promoting wealth for those people. And we'll talk about that coming up. Now, again, to put things in perspective, this is the last 10 or 12,000 years of human history. You can see we've had very few people the entire time, up until about 50 to 100 years ago. So, huge explosion of population. How do we feed everybody? What this graph shows here is where all of our aquaculture or seafood comes from. Now, going back to 1950, the light blue shaded area represents capture fisheries. So that's your traditional fishing with nets, hooks and lines. You can see that that made up the vast majority of all of our seafood up until about the 90s. We'll notice that the increase has actually plateaued, and what has happened is there are not enough fish to be harvested at the levels that we were harvesting at. So many of you know that lots of these fisheries have actually collapsed because they were harvested below sustainable levels. So the bottom line is we have an exploding population, and now there are not enough fish to come out of the ocean. So that dark blue line that has since increased is the aquaculture production. So that's what we are growing. This figure is a couple years old, and at the moment now roughly accounts for 50% of our total production. As far as what is being farmed, now this pie graph here relates to just animals. The vast majority of aquaculture is actually freshwater fishes, such as carps and tilapia. Many of you have heard of tilapia. It's become pretty popular at the moment. The vast majority of that is actually happening in Asia, in China. The second biggest category are your mollusks, and that includes the oysters, clams, and mussels. Again, something that we all like to eat around here in Florida. But these are farmed all over the world, from South America all the way to Asia. Your third biggest group are your crustaceans, and those are mainly comprised of shrimp, but also include crabs. Then come your fishes. Your diadromous fishes are ones that will migrate between fresh and salt water, like your salmon, and your marine fishes include things like cobia and flatfish. And the tiniest group there, aquatic animals that are not elsewhere included, is to me the most interesting. A tiny percentage, just 1% of total production, but includes cool stuff like sea cucumbers, sea urchins, jellyfish, and your more random things that you wouldn't really consider to be farmed. It's important to look at who is eating what in terms of consumption. Now, on the map here, the countries with the darker shade consume more seafood per capita, and the ones with the lighter shade consume less. So you can see from the figures over there, China, by a very large margin, consumes the most seafood. That may not come as a surprise to many of you, because the Chinese really do love their seafood. There is the old proverb that if it swims around in the ocean, they will eat it. The United States surprisingly comes in second. So we are the third biggest country in the world, and we consume the second most seafood. Now, something to keep in mind as far as the United States in terms of how much seafood we consume when we compare it to how much we produce. Now, almost 90% of the total aquaculture production in the world comes from Asia. So that's huge. The vast majority of everything is coming over there. And because of that, that is why we import lots of seafood from Asia, is because it is all being farmed over there. China alone contributes around 60% of the total production. The United States has about 1% of that total production. So even though we consume the second most seafood in the world, we only produce 1% of that. So we have this massive trade deficit where we are importing lots of seafood, not really producing any of it through aquaculture. Lots of notable countries that do aquaculture include Chile and Norway, also India, Vietnam, and Panama. And we're going to talk about Panama in a second because I actually had experience going there and working at a farm there. So again, aquaculture in the United States, even though we only have 1% of the global production, the majority of what we do here is mollusks. So not so much the fish, but we do lots of oysters and mussels. Lots of this is done in the Gulf. Again, I had mentioned that we import the vast majority of it. What's interesting, though, is lots of aquaculture in the United States is used for what is called stock enhancement. I'm not going to go too much into detail because this is pretty much an entire new lecture, but part of aquaculture isn't just raising food for ourselves, but is raising organisms that can be released back in the environment. Now, there are very differing thoughts on this. Some people think that it is an absolutely horrible idea. Other people think that it is a great idea because you are enhancing those wild stocks that are otherwise depleted from fishing. There's lots of pros and cons to this situation, but in the Northwest and Alaska, this is very, very common. So 40% of the salmon caught in Alaska and about 80 to 90% in the Northwest actually start their lives in hatcheries that are then released and are caught later on in fisheries. So it's a way of sustaining those fishing communities that are otherwise struggling. Now, again, this graph kind of summarizes it. If you look at the map over there, you'll see roughly by region where the aquaculture is being produced. Obviously, mostly coastal regions since it is a water resource, but aquaculture is actually done in all 50 states in some varying degree. It could be research, it can be small-scale homeowners that are making their own fish farms. And again, mostly bivalves, so we have oysters, clams, and mussels, lots of shrimp in the Gulf, and then there's mainly salmon in the Northwest. So that is pretty much sums up what's going on in the United States. Part of why it is not so common in the United States is when aquaculture was developing in the last couple decades, there was this large environmental movement against it, which saw it as the new agriculture. So people saw the shortcomings in agriculture and how it was an inefficient farming process and the pollution, kind of drummed up this whole movement to say that aquaculture was bad, we didn't want it, and the government introduced lots of regulations and legislations to prevent aquaculture from developing offshore. Now, for some reason that makes sense because we really value our coastal resources, especially here in Florida. People plainly don't want to see fish cages outside of their windows. So I know that if you were to try to start to put a large fish farm anywhere off the coast of Florida, you would have many of those communities complaining. And because those communities are so valuable and so wealthy, they basically had their say. So there's a long history of being kind of suppressed, and that leads us to only producing 1% of total production. Now, there are different scales of aquaculture. There's what I like to call small-scale aquaculture, which includes your more subsistence farming. So these are people in impoverished countries that are farming either to provide food for themselves and their local community, or they're farming to sell in local markets. And on the opposite end of that spectrum is the large-scale farming. And these are large corporations that are basically developing business models to try to make money by producing lots and lots of seafood. So we're going to have a quick look at these two here. Small-scale farming, these are a couple of examples. We have tilapia in Fiji. Algae culture is very popular, particularly because it's very easy to do, and you can make some money off of it. But again, this is more so for your own survival type farming. And you find this in a lot of developing countries. Lots of organizations such as the World Bank actually have programs to help develop aquaculture in these impoverished countries. And again, that is seen as a method of trying to promote wealth in these places. Now, on the opposite end, we have the big business fish farming. You can see from some of these pictures, it looks very different. We have an underwater scallop farm here in Japan where they hang these giant series of racks where they place the scallops. And bivalves are really great because once you get them to grow, you can actually put them out in the ocean and they feed themselves. So same thing with algae, is they feed off of the nutrients. They require no additional inputs, and that not only makes it cheaper in many regards, but it also makes it more environmentally friendly. Aquaculture can be done completely indoors on land as well. So the middle picture, we see an indoor koi farm. These are all done in tanks and raceways. And it can also be done way out in the open ocean. So we see some big offshore cages that are stuck out in the ocean. And we're going to go into more detail about those offshore cages because I've actually been there myself and seen it. Before we move on to the details of the fish farm process, I'd like to show this table here, which shows feed conversion ratios. Feed conversion ratio is basically how much food does it take to produce 1 pound of your product. So it's basically a measurement of how much input you have to put in to get whatever types of food that we like to eat. So you can see salmon has about a 1.2 feed conversion ratio, which means it takes about 1.2 pounds of feed for a single pound of that fish to grow. Now comparing it to some of our more well-liked menu items, you'll see that farming fish is much more efficient when it comes to use of feed and resources than, for instance, beef or pork. Now, this is just for the feed conversion ratio. The same can also be said about the amount of land required, since farming in the ocean is actually a three-dimensional space, and you can crowd them in more. It requires much less space available, it requires less freshwater use. Again, beef requires lots of fresh water to put in. So it is generally seen by many people as a more sustainable alternative to our traditional agriculture livestock. Now, we're going to progress into the next part of our presentation, where we're going to look at how to farm a fish from start to finish. Now, these are the 4 stages of farming, and it starts with your brood stock and getting them to spawn, obtaining those fertilized eggs, hatching them out, being able to not only keep them alive in sufficient numbers, but grow them to adulthood, at which point they are destined either for human consumption, for some other purpose, or they can actually be used again to start the breeding cycle. So that's completely closing the life cycle there, is raising your own young from eggs and getting those to breed and continuing on. So we're going to look at a model organism today. Our model organism is going to be cobia. How many of you, by show of hands, have heard of cobia? All right, so it looks like most of you. That's good. If you go back 20, 30 years ago, probably that number would have been very different because it was not very popular. Cobia can be found all over the world. So it can be found off the coast of India. You can find it in Asia, where it's actually called ling. And you can find it here off the coast of Florida. So it is a local fish. It migrates. They can get to be quite large. The largest adults are up to 6 feet and roughly 130 pounds. So that's pretty much my size. I'm not quite 6 foot, but they are very large fish, often mistaken for sharks sometimes when you see them in the water. Now, there are good species for aquaculture for a variety of reasons. The most important of which is that they have an extremely rapid growth rate. So when you're farming these animals, the longer it takes to farm them, the more money you're spending on keeping them alive, on feeding them. So you want to basically have animals that grow as quickly as possible. We've actually had cobia here at the aquarium before, and if you ask anybody that works here, we will tell you that they grow like beasts. So they grow to the point where they're so big that we have to take them out. We really don't have space for an animal like that. And in addition to that, they have a high fecundity, which means they can produce lots and lots of offspring. A single adult fish can produce over 1 million eggs in a single spawning event. And that's actually what we documented at the hatchery that I worked at. Now, I probably should have mentioned that everything that we're talking about now is what I did myself from my graduate school. So I was at the University of Miami, where they have the experimental hatchery there. And they're figuring out how to hatch and grow and figuring out technology for different aquaculture species. So I spent about 2 years there working with cobia. Lots of what we're going to talk about today is actually stuff that I've done. So back to the life cycle of the fish farming. It all starts with your brood stock, and those are animals that are capable of breeding. So they are sexually mature adults. And the whole idea is to be able to get them to spawn to obtain their eggs. Now, that can be quite difficult sometimes. For some fish, it is very easy to get them to spawn. Others, it has been impossible. And even with all the best science, we've been unable to figure out how to get them to spawn in tanks. So we obtain our brood stock from the wild. You're always looking for the healthiest specimens. What they did at the University of Miami is actually they went up to around Pompano Beach, and they asked local fishermen who have been fishing their whole lives, where do we get the best cobia? And of course, they went out and they got it within a couple minutes. It was then transported back to the University of Miami, treated for any kind of stress or injury that may have resulted from being caught and transported, and put into our system there. Now, this is what it looked like at the University of Miami hatchery. On the left, you see these are the broodstock holding tanks. So they would hold the adult specimens. There wouldn't be too many fish in there, probably about 14 to 20 at the most, enough to get reproduction happening. But these aren't just tanks. There are lots of components that go onto it, just like an aquarium that we have here. You'll see a whole series of filters, pumps, everything that's needed to run the water and also clean it. And on the right, you can see my mentor at the University of Miami. His name is Daniel Bonetti, who founded this whole hatchery. And they are holding up some very healthy and plump broodstock specimens. Let's have a look here. So again, spawning is very, very difficult to obtain. Ideally, you want these animals to spawn naturally, and that's what we were able to do at the University of Miami, is getting them to spawn seasonally based on temperature manipulation. Now, it's either to get them to spawn naturally, or there's an artificial way in which you can actually use hormones to trick them into thinking that they are pregnant and reproducing, and they will spawn that way. But basically, they figured out, and as it makes sense, is they looked at what the reproduction is in the wild and tried to mimic that in tank conditions. So they spawn in the summer months when temperature is warmer. So what we did is, starting wintertime, we would slowly increase the temperature into the tanks, made these animals get used to the fact that it's getting warmer, and we can do this actually tricking them, even if it's not summer, tricking them into thinking that it's summer, that they start spawning whenever that temperature is right. So they spawn typically sometime at night, towards the end of the night, and we would come in really early in the morning and collect the eggs in the incubators. Now, luckily, those fertilized eggs will float to the top, so they were siphoned off, and there was a thick layer of eggs when we'd come in the morning. So we'd collect those eggs, move them indoors, sterilize them to kill any kind of bacteria or parasites that may be in the water, because if you don't clean them with dense cultures of babies, they quickly get overrun by bacteria and other stuff like that. So it's very important to sterilize them, otherwise sterilize the bacteria that are in the eggs before you proceed.
How do you do that?
We use formalin. A very, very low dose of formaldehyde will kill parasites and bacteria, but keep animals alive. So eggs are moved into incubators where we try to actually hatch them out. Now, this is one of the most difficult steps in aquaculture, is hatching the animals. The hatching occurs roughly 24 hours after they are fertilized. So when they hatch out, they look a lot like what you see in the top left there. They actually have a yolk that they're still living off of. The larvae itself, after about a day or two, once the egg yolk is used up, looks like this picture in the bottom left here. That is a traditional fish larvae. Lots of times they are somewhat transparent, sometimes completely transparent, and they have yet to go through metamorphosis. So lots and lots of fish will go through metamorphosis, and kind of like a caterpillar turns into a butterfly, there are two separate life stages. Now, when metamorphosis happens, they start developing features that are more akin to their adult self. So lots of the body features that the adults have, the coloration, the fin, the body shape, that all starts developing after metamorphosis, which for cobia happens roughly 14 days after they hatch. Now, getting eggs to hatch historically hasn't been a problem. It's keeping them alive, because people can never figure out how to keep these tiny larvae alive. Now, these larvae are actually microscopic when they're born. They are tiny, tiny dots that are swimming around, and nobody could figure out how to keep them alive for the longest time until they realized that they actually need a live source of food. So what you see in the bottom right are two pictures of commonly used sources of live food. The one on the left is called a rotifer, which is a type of animal. And what we would do is we'd grow these animals. They were considered kind of vacuoles. They weren't very nutritious, but you could actually load their entire interior, what's inside the round space, with algae, and they became little packets of nutritious food. So the rotifers swim around. On the right, we see a brine shrimp, which we use quite extensively here. We actually have a whole display around the corner that's dedicated to the brine shrimp, where you'll be able to see not only the brine shrimp hatching on the window, but you'll be able to see them in the microscope. So these are quintessential live feeds for raising pretty much larval stages of anything, or plankton stages of anything. So once we figured out how to properly grow the live food, well, the rest became a little bit easier. From larvae to fingerling, which is the kind of the next phase of development, I mentioned the metamorphosis happens at around 14 days, where they get their traditional body features. After about 1 month, we would keep them in a hatchery. They would be tiny 1-gram fish. So they would be about 1 inch or 2 in size. So tiny little things. Now, if you look at the tank on the right there, a single one of our larval rearing tanks can have up to 20,000 individual fish in it. So there's lots and lots of individual fish. Now, what we would do is after we would hatch them out, grow them up for a month, and then at that point, we would keep some for further research and experiment, but we'd actually ship the vast majority of what we produced to a facility in Panama. And that's what we're going to talk about next, is this facility in Panama. The facility is called Open Blue Sea Farms. Now, I was there in 2011. They had only started in 2009 or 2010, so I actually went there to help build this setup for about a week. And this was through my class. We had a working partnership with them. Now, they have since become the largest offshore farm in the world. So they went from being virtually unknown to being the largest offshore farm in the world. They used to take our fish, but actually now they've developed their own technology. They do everything on site there themselves. But for a couple years, we were sending them all these little babies that we hatched and grew ourselves. And what they would do is they would do a short on-land grow-out phase, because when the animals are so small, they're not suitable to be out in the ocean yet. Just because of the currents, the disease, everything else that's out there, they would tend to die in large numbers. So they grow them up to be a suitable size, probably a couple 100 grams, at which point they are resistant enough to go out into the ocean. And what they would do is grow them in these massive, massive cages. Now, these are obviously pictures that I took. We can see going out to these cages that are offshore, climbing, that's me climbing up one of the cages. And on the right there, I'm sitting on top looking at these other cages. So if you can see a little bit of scale comparison, they are quite large. They spend about 2 years, up to 3 years total in these cages, at which point from there, they're ready to be harvested because they're quite large. Now, these cages are interesting. They're a pretty new technological marvel. As you can see, they are huge ocean cages, and they are engineered to withstand lots and lots of stresses. So we have not only the physical stress from storms, wind, and waves that you have to account for. Lots of times the early cages would simply fall apart from all the stress. We have predator stress. So I know that in Cape Eleuthera, when they first started these aquapods, they'd have problems of fish disappearing. And of course, they sent the diver team down in, and they looked inside the cage, and what did they find? Lots and lots of sharks. So you can imagine these sharks come by. They see, a self-contained cage of tasty fish, and that's pretty much heaven for them. All they have to do is find a way to get in. So they had to build them resistant to predator interactions, make the meshes more durable. And then your final problem is you may have noticed that anything out in the water, if you look at your pilings or your piers, tend to get fouled with organisms. There's all these encrusting sponges and other animals that like to make home on anything that's solid in the ocean. Same thing happens with these cages. Now, it can become so completely fouled with live stuff that water actually can't flow through it anymore, and you can imagine why that may be a problem. So these things have to be maintained quite well. What's neat about these aquapods you see on the right is they can actually be lowered and raised. So let's say if a big storm is coming, they'll actually drop it down deeper in the ocean. When it's time to either work on the cage itself or to see the animals or harvest them, you can raise it up out of the water, as you can see in the top right picture. And that kind of concentrates the fish into a smaller area so they're easier to harvest after that.
Neal, how do they put them out there? Is it a post in the middle?
They're anchored to the bottom, and they are basically tugged around with boats. So depending on the phase of where the animal is, so the younger animals will be more inshore. For the older animals, they'll actually tow it miles and miles offshore. So this has a number of benefits. Offshore being the water is very clean. And also, when you're so far offshore with those currents, it is very, very difficult, no matter how much input you put in, no matter how much feed you use, it is very difficult to pollute the water out there. Just because simply there's so much of it. There have been many, many tests that looked at the environmental impacts of these offshore cages and have found that when they are properly situated offshore, they have zero detectable impact. Now, the problem comes when you have lots and lots of cages that are concentrated in an inshore bay, which lots of times has poor flushing And that will lead to some environmental issues, which we'll talk about at the very end.
What feedstock do you use and how do you feed it?
What feed? They use commercial prepared feed. So they are essentially pellets that are you can buy in the market that are specially designed for fish feed. Now these pellets are made mostly out of fish meal, but what they've done is they've actually tried to make it more sustainable by using other forms of protein. So these animals need protein to grow. Traditionally, it's been fish protein, so you take up fish, you basically grind it up, and it becomes a paste, and you make it into pellets. So we actually use that here at the aquarium. What they used to do, see if we can go back here, is you can actually see this boat here is filled up with bags of feed. The traditional way was, at least when I was there, that guy is standing there with a cup and he is cupping up feed and basically throwing it onto the net where it would fall through and all the animals start going crazy. Now, I've seen ever since I left, they have obviously upgraded their systems. They have automatic feeders now. So they have pumps that'll basically shoot out feed out of these feed cannons, for lack of a better word to describe them. So everything has been streamlined and automated since then. So basically, they're grown up in these large cages. After appropriate size, they are ready to be marketed. Now, they're harvested at around 8 to 10 pounds, which is, again, pretty small for a cobia, but at the same time enough to obtain a fillet off of them. The harvesting process usually requires, obviously, the filleting, the cleaning, the packing. That is usually done off-site by private companies. Here in the middle, you actually see the founder of Open Blue Sea Farms. His name is Brian O'Hanlon. And what's nice is that when we were there working on their cobia, at the very last day, they pulled a fish out of their tank, and they actually had a cobia tasting session. So that was surprisingly the first time, even after working with cobia for so many years, that I had ever tasted cobia, and the first time that I can definitively say that I had had farm-raised fish. And now I don't eat a lot of fish, so I'm not the best person to tell you how it compares to wild fish, but it was quite delicious. I know cobia is an extremely well sought after animal because it's so versatile. So it's sushi grade, it can be used in grills and whatnot. You can actually buy farm-raised cobia at Publix now. It says it's from Panama. I don't know for sure, but I can say with probably 90 to 95% confidence that it came from Open Blue Sea Farms. Pretty incredible animals. Now, I'm going to finish up the last portion of this with a quick discussion of the environment. Now, any kind of human activity is going to have, any kind of human farming activity is going to have an impact on the environment. And this has been one of the biggest contentious points in aquaculture. But despite that, lots of my research at the University of Miami was focused on how to make it more sustainable. And in addition to that, I've realized that the industry as a whole is really trying to do a better job at being more sustainable. So discharges of waste or pollution is the biggest concern. And we're going to talk briefly in a second about how they are trying to do better with that. Alteration of natural habitat is another problem. They're trying to solve that by moving things offshore, so we don't even have to use land. We don't have to use as much nearshore water space. And also, using this fish meal and fish oil is a big problem. Now, people see that a large quantity of live fish stocks from the ocean have to be used to produce farmed fish. And I'd mentioned when you asked about it before that what they're actually trying to do is find the maximum percentage of that fish resource in the food that can be replaced with, for instance, soy protein. So they've actually done that is lots of the pellets that we use right now are almost 50% soy or non-fish protein. And by doing that, we are decreasing our reliance on wild stocks. Now, as far as the land use is concerned, conventional shrimp farming is probably the worst for the environment. This is very popular in Asia and in other parts of the world. It's almost non-existent here in America because of our regulations. But basically, to farm these shrimps, you have to clear large areas of land. That land is usually coastal, so you end up clearing mangroves and other sensitive habitat. Now, Unfortunately, this is the way that most of our our shrimp currently are being farmed. But that's not to say it is the only way. So if you can actually do shrimp in intensive recirculating systems on land, can have close to zero output, but it requires much more technology. There's actually there's a couple places in Florida that are growing sustainable shrimp. So unfortunately, this is probably at the top of the hit list for unsustainable seafoods. Even when it's wild caught, it has the highest proportion of bycatch, which means that when you're going out and trying to catch shrimp, you end up catching lots of other animals that you don't intend to. Lots of times you don't need these animals, so they end up being dumped back off the boat. But of course, by that point, they are dead. So bycatch is a very big problem in the shrimp industry. So hopefully there will be lots of work to help to improve the environmental aspects of shrimp farming. As far as discharges are concerned, I wanted to quickly mention what I did my thesis research on. And that is something called integrated multi-trophic aquaculture, which is basically, simply put, is more environmentally sustainable farming. So the whole premise of IMTA is what it's called, is that you have your fish, which is what we're doing now. You feed these fish, they produce waste. That waste typically becomes pollution in most other places. But the whole idea is that we can use other organisms to extract those wastes and to use it. So for instance, in this diagram here, we have fish being farmed in the ocean. We have shellfish or some kind of bivalve that actually eats the particulates like the feces and turns that into food source for itself. And then we have algae that is behind that, and the algae absorbs all the dissolved waste. So these are animals that can actually use waste from the farmed animals to grow themselves. So not only do you not need to feed these animals specifically, but they grow in larger quantities. They grow better when situated close to fish farms. So my thesis was more focused on the algae filtration part, and that's interesting because we actually use algae filtration here at the exhibit. So all of our large ecosystem tanks that we have here are filtered off of algae. And the algae absorbs all the nutrients in the water that come out from the fish and essentially clean the water while growing new algae. Now, that's great because we can use algae for a whole number of stuff. We use it for fertilizers, we use it for food, we use it for feeds. Red algae are used in lots of products that you and I are very familiar with, can produce agar, and is used in everything from ice cream to toothpaste. So very, very versatile products. And the shellfish, well, it doesn't need to be expanded on. Everybody likes eating shellfish. So these things work very synergistically together. Now, this is the saltwater version. There is a freshwater version called aquaponics. This is something that many homeowners, if you have enough land or enough space, lots of people have developed their own systems. You can actually go to workshops to develop this. But basically, it's the same principle, except instead of growing algae and shellfish, you are recycling your dirty fish water into your vegetable garden. They are working on how to do this on a large scale. It's neat because in the recycling, you end up with very little waste that's having to be dumped out into the environment because all of that, what we call waste, becomes a valuable resource for something else. So you grow these vegetables off of fish waste, all nutrients which are essentially nitrogen and phosphorus, which are considered fertilizers. They've actually found that some aquaponic systems actually not only grow much better, but have a better nutritional quality as well than simply growing them out in the wild. So there is lots of potential for aquaculture. There is a lot that is happening in the world. I hope I've given you guys an overview as to the grand scale of what's happening. The fact that 50% of all the fish that you're eating comes from farms at this point. There's a lot of debate as to whether this is a good thing or not, but the truth is that it is happening, it is developing, it's the fastest growing sector in the world. So at this point, it's not so much a question of whether it should be here or not, but rather to accept it as a reality and to figure out how to do it in the best way that we can.